If I asked you to think of England's great cities, many images might come to mind. The gleaming might of London, the gritty brick of Manchester, the grand arches of Newcastle, so on and so forth. There's no shortage of places. But if I could hazard a guess, a scene from Birmingham would be quite unlikely to dominate. Which is odd, as Birmingham is Britain's second largest city. Its metropolitan area is home to over 4 million people, almost half the size of London. And whilst, yes, city proper definitions are flawed, the city proper is larger than Manchester and Leeds put together. It's certainly not unimportant either, economically or culturally. It and its surrounding areas have not only made a mark on the world we live in, they created it. So much of the Industrial Revolution happened here. It was once the workshop of the world, and even today, its Jaguar Land Rover cars are desired all over the planet. Its music, the likes of Black Sabbath and Duran Duran, amongst many others, is listened to by billions, and its literature, chiefly Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, spawned one of the largest genres in existence. Over the past century, too, Birmingham has become one of the most multicultural cities in the world, a dynamic that has inspired yet more, such as the poetry of Benjamin Zephaniah. Clearly, this is a city with no shortage of culture, but it's not often credited for much of this. Why? Well, I think we've got to be honest with ourselves here. Much of Birmingham just isn't that attractive, and its rich identity often struggles to break through onto the streets. For a place the size of Berlin, and much larger than the likes of Amsterdam, it can feel almost dead. You'll know what I mean if you're familiar with it. The centre is tiny, and whilst there are definitely nice parts, it's not bursting with life like any other large city. Even the proudest Brummies are sort of ironically proud. If a Londoner visited every London in the world, you'd think they loved London. If someone from Birmingham visited every Birmingham in the world, that's a comedy series. But why is it like this, and must it always be this way? Let's try and find out. You can usually apply a sort of materialist lens to a city. A prosperous city is generally a successful one, so it should follow that any plan to revive Birmingham should involve a large economic strategy. Except, must it really? Birmingham is famously the city of 1,000 trades. It doesn't have one particular area it specialises in, and whilst this wasn't necessarily the case in the past, a diverse economy is generally more robust nowadays, so it makes little sense to try and force an industry onto Birmingham. Not that you'd need to. It's clearly capable of attracting investment. A lot of financial firms in particular, like Goldman Sachs and HSBC, have moved their UK headquarters there. Evidently, people do want to invest in and grow Birmingham, but this doesn't mean that everything is all rosy. There is rampant inequality, with many of the city's wards ranking amongst the most deprived in the country. All these high-paying jobs are no use if people can't get to them. Birmingham's effective population is constrained by poor public transport, but we'll get onto this later. And it's probably no coincidence that the unemployment rate is far higher than the national average. Alright, so what do we have to do to make Birmingham do more and spread this opportunity to the entire city? Well, I think there are probably two main reasons why more people and businesses don't invest in Birmingham, even from within the city. The first is that they can't, the infrastructure isn't there, and the second is that it's not cool to. As I said before, compared to other comparable cities like Liverpool or Manchester, Birmingham is neither particularly beautiful nor lively. Obviously, not every business or person is interested in this, but many are, and having a pleasant city is important for attracting talent. No offence to Newport, but is it really a wonder that 90% of Office of National Statistics staff left when the organisation moved there from London? The thing is, these two problems are sort of part and parcel. They have largely the same causes, and to understand them, we have to go back to the dawn of Birmingham. Or well, I suppose, the mid-morning of Birmingham. Like anywhere else, until the second half of the 19th century, Birmingham was a very compact city, built around walking for obvious reasons. Its urban design was pretty typical of an early industrial city, so the interesting stuff only really gets to develop following the arrival of the tram. You're probably familiar with the streetcar suburbs of the United States, which are often considered excellent examples of urban design. Maybe it's just cultural differences, but I don't actually think they're that good. Anyway, that's besides the point. Birmingham also has its fair share of tramway suburbs, but of a British variety that I think are much better than the American ones. The abundant trees, ornate architecture, and dense plan make for interesting neighbourhoods. These form the nicest parts of the city even today, and the early 20th century explosion in tram-based development has wrapped Birmingham in a rather pleasing belt of these sorts of places. But unfortunately, by the 1950s, tramways were falling out of fashion and Birmingham's network was closed. All things considered though, its rail network fared reasonably well, and despite one or two closures, its suburban trains remained mostly intact. Thus, from the 1930s onwards, a sort of mini Metroland began to develop around railway stations. Whilst previous development was still relatively organic, in the interwar period, Neville Chamberlain, yes, that one, he was then a Birmingham councillor, was very keen on the idea of what were known as cottage suburbs, managed communities built in one go and planned from the top down. Winding streets, large spacious detached houses, and shops centred on major road junctions all led to a sort of less characterful feel than many of the older districts. However, this was still no Los Angeles. At this point, very few people drove, and accordingly most of your essential needs could be met within a short walk. Bus and train services were nearby, and even though these areas were certainly more amenable to car ownership than elsewhere, it still wasn't essential, and you'd have to be pretty stupid to drive into the city centre. But there was a man who hated this. He didn't just think that it should be possible to take a car into central Birmingham, he wouldn't rest until the entire city had remade itself in the image of the automobile. His name was Herbert Manzoni, and he just so happened to be Birmingham's chief civil engineer. The late great historian Chris Upton coined the phrase that at some point in the 20th century, Birmingham decided to abolish the past. But perhaps it's better expressed as at some point, Herbert Manzoni decided to abolish the past. Obviously, it is a lot more nuanced than this, and I don't mean to speak ill of the dead, but there are few people who can have caused as much damage to Birmingham as Manzoni. He thought Birmingham was old-fashioned and holding itself back, and he almost seemed to welcome the prospect of World War blowing it up, allowing him to rebuild it from scratch. In 1941, anticipating more bombing, he created a commission to plan out a future for Birmingham, but as it happened, the war ended with the city largely unscathed. Of course though, good old Manzoni wouldn't let peace get in the way of his ideas. If the Nazis wouldn't destroy the city, he'd do it himself. And so began the mass demolition of huge swathes of the city, nominally for slum clearance, but these were definitely not all slums. Don't misinterpret me, the living conditions in these places were dreadful for the most part, and certainly many buildings should have been demolished. But there were still plenty of perfectly fine streets that, if properly cared for, could have been beautiful. These were real communities with real people. They needed to be improved, but they didn't need to be wiped off the face of the earth. But wiped off they were, and thousands of terraces were replaced with a lot of nothing. There were lots of Soviet-style tower blocks and low-density housing, but the main defining feature of post-war construction was that there was just much less stuff than existed before. Housing is spread out and set back from the road with huge green spaces. This sounds good, but the main result was increased isolation. Communities didn't completely break down, but they certainly weakened, and thousands were forced out of not just their homes, not just their neighbourhoods, but their city. This isn't like America, there wasn't really any ulterior motive here, it was done with the best of intentions, it just didn't work. It seemed that the wishes of many of the people who were actually going to be displaced were largely ignored. And by now, hundreds of towers have been pulled down, and many of the residents of the remaining ones would like theirs to go too. Isn't this awful? People should be able to love their home, and at the very least live in it comfortably. But it wasn't just housing Manzoni had an impact on, it was the entire urban fabric of the city. This man was extremely unsentimental. To quote him, "There is little of real worth in our architecture." Really, Herbert? That's news to me, and it would be even bigger news if I lived before he wreaked his havoc. He considered roads far more important, and levelled communities, strangled centuries of history, and altogether vandalised the urban realm for slightly higher vehicle throughput. Though not directly done by him, the grand Victorian structures of Birmingham New Street Railway Station and Birmingham Central Library were torn down in favour of concrete monoliths, and architectural preferences aside, the new buildings were just much less pleasant to be in and around than the old ones. Perfectly encapsulating all of this was the famously beautiful Market Hall, which was bombed during the war, but instead of being repaired, was torn down and replaced with Manzoni Gardens. Before long, as you may have predicted, the gardens ended up as a centre for antisocial behaviour. Manzoni was reportedly a very charismatic figure and converted many people in the upper echelons of British society to his cause. He was knighted and retired to some praise, with a building at Loughborough University, a centre for civil engineering, being named after him, and it still is. But in a poetic twist of irony, Birmingham soon started to reconsider, and with little sentimentality for the era with even less, began demolishing many of his flagship projects. Monsoni Gardens was converted back into a shopping centre, though this time for larger brands than the original market, and the new central library was replaced with an even newer one. New Street Station got a hint of grandeur back, and it's the streets that survived that have become Birmingham's most popular. Today, it's hard to believe that Colmore Row, widely regarded as one of the city's finest, was once earmarked for demolition. It's no surprise, or at least it shouldn't be, that building like this created an unpleasant urban form, and despite some recent improvements, Birmingham is still strangled by its roads. In the 1990s, a tram line was built between Birmingham and Wolverhampton, erroneously called the West Midlands Metro. It's currently in the process of being extended, though the extensions aren't exactly massive, and it's a perfectly fine tramway. But it's nowhere near enough. Accordingly, a lot of Birmingham's transport is provided by buses, and quite remarkably for such a large city, they're almost all operated by one company, National Express. This is a good thing, and it means that despite privatisation, Birmingham still has a relatively integrated public transport system. I'm in two minds about National Express as an operator. On the one hand, coverage is pretty good, they have an attractive fleet, and running hours are impressive. But on the other, they've overseen a pretty drastic decline in bus usage, and it's hard to argue with those numbers. Regardless of their calibre though, already having a single operator negates one of the main benefits of franchising, when the local authority takes control of routes. I'm not opposed to franchising in the West Midlands, I think it would probably be an improvement, but I'm not sure it's necessarily the best use of resources. Or, more to the point, more needs to be done, it can't just be franchising. The standard methods apply here: run more frequent service, more direct routes, and increase bus priority. A tried and tested recipe for success. And particular emphasis on that last one. It's absolutely ridiculous that most main roads into Birmingham city centre have no continuous bus priority. Like, look at this. This is within the middle ring road. There are 6 lanes, there's a massive central reservation, there's no excuse not to put bus lanes in here. Anyway, so long as the passenger doesn't notice and the service is reasonably well integrated, I don't really care who owns the buses. But ideally they'd be under the control of the Regional Transport Authority. You can watch my video on that, so franchising may be helpful. In any case, it would mean no more diamond buses, and that can only be a good thing. But in a city the size of Birmingham, buses should not form the backbone of public transport at all. In most big cities, there are huge swathes of places where most able-bodied people don't really ever use buses. I'm not sure this is necessarily desirable. We don't want buses to become just a social safety net. However, I do think it is indicative of Birmingham's poor rail-based transport that for many, if not most people, the key corridors into the city centre are done by bus. This needs to change. Rail-based transport is more efficient, faster, more reliable, and creates better places. In 2019, Tom Forth, a data scientist who used to live in Birmingham, published, in collaboration with Transport for the West Midlands, some very interesting data about bus journey times. I've linked the article in the description and do go and read it, it's fascinating. But in summary, Birmingham is less productive than you'd expect for its size. And the reason for this is probably because its effective population is much smaller than its actual one. Because its population is dependent on buses to get into the city centre, and buses are slow and get stuck in traffic, at peak times the number of people within access of the city shrinks to about half its official population. Now, when you consider this true population, so to speak, Birmingham stops looking like a productivity outlier and follows international trends almost perfectly. An extensive tram network would, in effect, double the size of the city, and the economic benefits of that would be huge. So large, in fact, that it almost wouldn't matter what the cost was. In 2013, Birmingham, the city proper that is, generated around £7.5 billion in tax revenue. However, it received over £11 billion in spending. In the intervening years, spending demands have only increased and the productivity gap has grown, so it's probably even worse now. And spending a few billion on mass transport becomes a blindingly obvious move. Now, admittedly, you could get a lot of the benefits of trams from bus rapid transit, where you run a tram-style service with dedicated rights-of-way, fancy bus stops and cool-looking vehicles, except instead of them running on rails, they run on tyres. This is not an adequate alternative for a tram in most cases, but it is better than nothing. So in his article, Tom Forth was pleased to report that 7 bus rapid transit lines were being constructed across Birmingham, called Sprint. The first few routes were supposed to open in 2022 to coincide with the Commonwealth Games, which, by the way, was a masterpiece of transport management. I went there and it was excellent. I'd love to make a video on it. The other routes were supposed to open in 2026, so construction is surely well on the way with those, right? No. Not a single sprint route has been completed. The project started in 2014, for goodness sake. Part of the point of BRT is you get it up and running quickly. The problem isn't that construction has been delayed or anything like that, it's just that the city appears to have given up. They just didn't build it for the Commonwealth Games. I don't know why. And Transport for the West Midlands has quietly dropped all mention of this once grand network plan. All that remains on their website is reference to the Sprint Corridor, note the singular, which should run between Walsall and Solihull. Even this, though, is far from BRT. Some new bus lanes have been installed, they're marked on green here, and they want to install more marked in red, though no time frame is given. Yellow already existed, and blue will not have anything at all. This isn't bus rapid transit, this is a few small upgrades. Welcome upgrades most definitely, but they barely touch the sides. The main benefit has probably been some beautiful new bus stops, but they're not branded Sprint or anything like that, and no special buses are used. I hate to say it, but I think the Sprint network is probably dead. I'd love to be wrong, but after 10 years with almost nothing to show, things certainly don't bode well. Instead, let's be a little more ambitious. What network should Birmingham have? Not what we think will happen, but what will be genuinely good. Well, there are many different views on what this should be. Former Mayor Andy Street had quite a good plan, and I'd be very happy if this were to go ahead. I think we can do better, though. We first want to get the rail network in order. Birmingham's existing suburban trains are pretty good. The Cross City Line and Snow Hill lines run every 15 minutes, but just the Cross City is electrified. Obviously, you'd also want to electrify the Snow Hill lines. This would be quite simple, and you've pretty much got a ready-made metro. The Snow Hill lines are almost completely dedicated to these suburban services, and if you reinstated the quad tracking on the Chiltern Main Line, the trackbed's already there, it would be very easy. You could even go beyond the pre-pandemic 10-minute frequency, possibly every 8, but we'd have to see how it goes. The Cross City should be similarly bumped up to every 10 minutes, and the Wolverhampton to Walsall trains should go to probably every 20. With a few new stations added in. These could be complemented by an also every 20-minute loop via Handsworth with a couple new stations as well, interlining to give a nice every 10-minute frequency to the likes of Perry Bar and Ladywood. But hold on, there isn't the track capacity for all of this. No, there isn't. You'd have to build 2 new tunnels. One that would broadly follow the Cross City line from Kings Norton, where the line goes from 4 to 2 tracks, under the suburbs with better located stations, to a new underground station at Birmingham New Street, and finally re-emerging in the disused track by Duddeston. This would enable you to close most of the local stations between Kings Norton and Birmingham, and by removing the stopping trains, you'd free up the line for more regional and intercity services, which could also run a lot faster. The other tunnel would originate near Soho Depot, from where it would follow the West Coast Main Line with 1 or 2 new stops, and then join the Cross City Tunnel at New Street. These 2 things would allow you to run many more services, all of a better quality. You'd effectively try and do an Elizabeth Line Birmingham edition, and you'd brand these trains as a metro service just like the Snow Hill lines. Now, Birmingham has difficult geology, digging tunnels would be very expensive, but we're talking about well under 10 miles of tunnel in a city that has none, and the benefits would be extraordinary. The Elizabeth Line involved 26 miles of tunnelling, and that was perfectly justifiable. To say that Birmingham doesn't deserve any is ridiculous. Furthermore, let's not forget existing freight-only lines. For example, the route from Walsall to Water Orton via Sutton Coldfield. This could very easily receive passenger trains once again. There's also a long stretch between Stourbridge and Wolverhampton. Other than one really annoying point where the line has been built on, the track bed is more or less entirely intact, so it would be fairly straightforward to resurrect. Now let's turn to trams. Everyone loves trams, and they're very flexible. They can be put almost anywhere. I'd propose something like this, compared to this, which is what it is currently. Orange is rail lines, blue is tram lines, and dashed lines signify something under construction. Feel free to pause the video and take a look. Trams would have several routes into and through the city centre. Obviously, you keep the existing street running, from Snow Hill to New Street, the Library and Edgbaston, as well as the new branch to Digbeth. But you'd also build a new underground through route. But hold on, that'd be really expensive. And no, it wouldn't. You'd just reuse an existing right-of-way. Much of Herbert Manzoni's inner ring road has since been closed to most traffic, but some of it remains. This is the A38. It's a right pain to cross and isn't very pleasant to be around, so it artificially constrains the size of Birmingham city centre. The worst bit is that this road is completely unnecessary. Birmingham city centre has a large ring road that through traffic can follow relatively easily, and the entire A38 is either very wide or sandwiched between another road that could provide an alternative route. You do not need a grade-separated expressway right through the heart of your city. This is ridiculous, and it needs to go. Or rather, it needs to be converted into a tramway. You could have one tram line on each side of the carriageway, or even put both of them in the same one. This would allow you to use the other for something else. Maybe a linear park, or possibly even some tiny houses. Sounds a bit ridiculous, sure, but I can guarantee you these would be some of the most popular houses in the city. In the underground stretch by the library, you would install a new underground station, and on the other side of the carriageway you could create a sort of mini arcade, with small shops, cafes, I don't know, offices, it doesn't matter. The council could decide. With proper lighting and trams hurtling past on the other side of the wall, it could be quite an interesting atmosphere, and with attractive rates, so small businesses could base themselves there, I think this could quickly become an iconic and much sought after destination. Of course, maybe it wouldn't, I'm not a property developer, but the principle remains. There are many different things you can do with an empty expressway, and in a city centre, almost all of them are better uses than a road. Putting trams on an old expressway isn't some pie-in-the-sky idea, it's already been done. In Birmingham no less, in 5 ways. We just need to be a lot more ambitious. Now, I know what you're thinking. All of this is insane, Birmingham can't have this many trams. And well, it can. In fact, it used to have a lot more, when the city's population was much smaller. And alright, that was a different time, but when you compare it to different cities across Europe of similar sizes, you'll notice that they have more extensive tram and train networks. Brussels is smaller than Birmingham, but look at its map. Okay, it's a capital, but what about Antwerp, which is less than a third the size of Birmingham? Or Dusseldorf, or Cologne, or Dortmund, or Frankfurt? I could go on and on. But anyway, this isn't like a next year thing. It would take a long time to build all these tram lines, and you'd spread it out over 15 to 20 years as part of a rolling programme. Over that time, the teams tasked with building them would become very experienced, and could keep costs down as we see in France. This expertise can then be rolled out across Leeds, Liverpool and other cities. You know what? Even London. It's got to catch up with Paris and its circular orbital tramway things. But we're getting sidetracked. Back to Birmingham. Building trams in Birmingham will be relatively straightforward. Somewhat uniquely for a British city, it has lots of wide arterial roads. Some might even call them boulevards. And these are exactly the sort of streets that are easy and cheap to add trams to. Tramways seem a perfect fit for Birmingham's low-density sprawl. Why not get cracking, and in the meantime use bus rapid transit on the proposed routes? Now to housing. If Birmingham does see major economic growth, it's inevitable that there will be more demand for it. You absolutely do want wealthy people in the city, having them around is good for everyone. But obviously you don't really want to see existing residents replaced, and a high cost of living isn't great even for the people who can stay. The best way to protect against this is by keeping housing cheap, and there are 2 things we've got to do here. Firstly, yes in my backyard, or YIMBY, we've got to allow things to be built. The planning process must be sped up and made more predictable, but this shouldn't be done by central government forcing developments upon local authorities. Not only does this remove the ability of cities to plan their own futures, it's also unpredictable. If you're trying to build 1,000 houses, and you think the council's going to reject it, sure, the government might overrule that, but that's not guaranteed. No, we need a proper institutional method of increasing construction, whilst retaining the ability to choose. Instead, we need more planning officers to ensure that approvals are dished out in a more timely manner, and a system that sort of emulates aspects of zoning could be introduced where in different areas, developments that meet a set of criteria are automatically approved. Now obviously, exactly what those criteria are is up for debate, but if they can be agreed, this would be a huge incentive for new construction in Birmingham. Secondly though, you can't leave everything to the free market. The local authorities should be building high-quality social housing en masse, to the extent that it returns to its original intention, of it being housing for everyone, not just the poorest. This vision mostly lives on in Vienna, and the result is living costs that would make the rest of Europe jealous. Obviously, to make this work, you'd need to repeal the right to buy laws, where any resident of a council-owned home can buy it after just a few years. I'm not saying that council houses can't be sold, but the authority shouldn't be forced into selling them. Anyway, once you've got rid of right to buy, social housing becomes a real win-win. You're providing the people who live in them with good, cheap housing, of course, but if it's providing competition to market-based housing, it acts as a downward pressure on prices for everyone else. It's also a good source of revenue for the council, and helps them fund other things that are more expensive. This is not to mention the urban realm improvements of a beautiful new development, and if the council is doing it itself, it can simply build a nice place without having to hope that a private developer does the same. Speaking of nice places, you can have the best architecture in the world, but it still won't be very enjoyable unless the street holds up too. Let's take 2 examples. This is the Church Street car park in the northern quarter of Manchester. Most people would agree that it's not the prettiest of buildings, and it is officially an eyesore according to the council, who are now selling it off for redevelopment. By contrast, this is the Godwin's Free House, a pub in the village of Bartestry in Herefordshire. It was built by the wealthy tilemaker William Henry Godwin, a man who I imagine was less terrifying than the only surviving photo of him. It's a beautiful building, and one that most people would probably agree looks very nice. But between this and the car park, which building would you actually prefer to be around? Not in, but around. Now, I'm not sure, but I think most people would probably say the car park. It's an ugly building, but it's surrounded by trees, and the adjacent streets are pleasantly proportioned. The Godwins, meanwhile, feels out of place. It's plonked in the middle of a sea of asphalt, with little shade, a tiny pavement, and a scene largely devoid of life. Now, Bartesley is a village. It's obviously not going to have a bustling city street. Indeed, a vibrant village is almost an oxymoron. But my point still stands. When it comes to being around the Godwins or the car park, the actual architecture matters little. The built environment is far more important. Perhaps a better set of examples can be found in Belgium. All of these places look gorgeous, but is it really the architecture that's making them so? No, there's huge architectural variety, and that does make things more visually interesting, but the real reason they're so good is because of the streets. The Netherlands is often regarded as the best place in the world for urban design, and that might be true, but Belgium is probably the fastest improving, thanks to their rolling program of street remodelling. Instead of simply resurfacing roads, they completely redesign them, and I've mentioned this before, but we should have a similar program in the UK. Obviously, it shouldn't be exclusive to Birmingham, but the city could do it itself if central government isn't obliging. Good road rebuildings are enormously positive projects. Besides the obvious aesthetic improvements, new street trees reduce temperatures, increase biodiversity, and improve air quality. Small stormwater gardens absorb water and reduce the strain on the drainage system, and if you do it right, many more people can get around much faster too. Long story short, Birmingham isn't actually an ugly city. Its missing link is just the roads. We really should rebuild them, ideally using proper local materials. But another big part of making streets pleasant is their safety. Obviously this includes reducing the threat from motor vehicles via better design, but Birmingham also has a crime rate quite some way above the national average. The largest category of crime reports in Birmingham are for violent and sexual offences, and the post-pandemic data is beginning to plateau at a far higher rate than it was in the 2010s. Now, I don't mean to fearmonger. Birmingham is still in Britain, and Britain is still a very safe country. Many categories of crime, like theft from a person, are either not increasing or falling, but others, like shoplifting, are ticking up alarmingly. Is Birmingham's crime problem overstated? Probably, but it's still not great, and these increases are troubling. We don't want people to feel unsafe out and about, and shoplifting is obviously bad for business. Tesco has recently upped their security, with better protection for staff, more guards, and anti-shoplifting measures on shelves. This isn't very nice for the customer, but Tesco's a large company, they can afford it. Small businesses on tight profit margins, though, well, it may be harder. Of course, crime is extremely complex. There's no single reason why it's gone up or single way to make it go down. But we can make a few guesses. Over the last decade, police numbers in the West Midlands fell by 24%. There's been a recent uptick, but it's still not back to its 2010 levels, despite a considerable population increase. More police officers, especially the proverbial bobbies on the beat, would naturally go some way. Perhaps the biggest change to perceptions of safety, though, would be from simply having more people in the city centre. After about 8 PM, central Birmingham starts to empty out, and this can be uncomfortable. Jane Jacobs, the legendary city thinker, devised the eyes on the street theory that the simple presence of lots of people living their lives acts as a major deterrent to crime. Now, between you and me, I'm not entirely sure this is true. Whilst it's obviously very difficult to get street-by-street breakdowns of crime, the list of Britain's highest crime cities isn't quite the same as the list of its least vibrant. No, the actual correlation is pretty obvious. Wealth. Clearly, one of the best ways to reduce crime is to reduce poverty. Except, unfortunately, that's certainly a difficult problem to solve. If distributed equitably, increased economic opportunity in the city would have an inverse effect on poverty, but in the meantime, more targeted measures like improving the condition of social housing and enhancing education should probably be pursued. Now just briefly, a word on culture. Birmingham has certainly spawned a lot of culture, but it's not really recognised as it should be. To give just one example, Station Street, right next to New Street Railway Station, like literally outside the exit, is home to the Crown Pub, where Ozzy Osbourne gave his first performance, some fascinating architecture, a theatre, and Britain's oldest cinema, the Electric. Yet the Crown Pub has been boarded up for years, and the Electric closed down in 2024. The street is neglected, and you'd never guess its history by looking at it. Oh, and a lot of it is planned to be demolished in the coming years. This situation is absurd. Many other musicians have connections to the immediate vicinity, and many cities would give anything to have this level of cultural history in such a perfect location. The Save Station Street campaign has some convincing ideas as to what could be done, though I'm probably a bit more amenable to there being housing involved. Either way, this is emblematic of the huge tourism potential that Birmingham is missing out on, and even when putting tourism aside, establishments like this are important cultural artefacts, and help encourage new talent, just as they did with Birmingham's last generation of artists. Alright, you might say, this is all very well and good, but how does this actually get delivered? Well, this is just as much a political question as it is a technical one. First and foremost, national political parties need to get out of the hair of their local divisions. Some degree of standards enforcement is obviously fine, but it's been taken too far. We need a situation where local parties are allowed and encouraged to campaign on important issues and devise cohesive plans. There should be more structures in place to identify promising local people and encourage them to stay in the area and make a difference instead of leaving, as many do now. Obviously not everyone leaves. Birmingham's a major global city. It would be ridiculous to suggest that there's a lack of talent, but it is unfortunately true that too many people are probably dragged away to London or even Manchester. Once we've got the right people interested, we need to get the right people elected. And in order to be elected, you probably have to be the nominee of a major political party. Now, I'm not going to name any names, but if we're being perfectly honest, oftentimes the major political parties don't select the best candidates. In fact, it's ridiculous when you think about it. The government or its Westminster opposition gets to choose who's going to be mayor. There's a simple way to avoid this: primaries. By holding a local election to decide who the party nominates, hopeful mayors have to dedicate their loyalties to the local people, not the central party. And they also have to worry about competition from rivals who they might not expect. This leads to a form of local politics that's more dynamic and adaptive to the needs of constituents, and it can launch promising new faces into the spotlight with remarkable speed. Whatever you think of him and his policies, the rise of New York's Zoran Mamdani is a real symbol of healthy local democracy, and his campaign, as well as the structures that allowed it to happen, have ignited an interest in municipal politics amongst many people who'd never even considered it. We stand to gain a lot from this, and mayors like Andy Burnham show us the potential of leaders who challenge the government. Anyway, okay, let's say we've elected the perfect mayor. There's no one better for the job. Even they, though, won't be able to do a massive amount of good if the whole city region is squabbling and refusing to work together. Historically, this is what has set Greater Manchester and the West Midlands apart. In GM, the boroughs work together much better than they do in the West Midlands. This can be seen in the name itself. West Midlands, what does that even mean? You can't call a city that, that's what the region's called. If someone tells you they're from the West Midlands, they could be from anywhere between the hills of Shropshire and the centre of Coventry. No, this is ridiculous. I'm going to say it, the combined authority area known as the West Midlands is just Greater Birmingham. It's not like West Yorkshire where things are genuinely ambiguous. There's a clear Birmingham conurbation, and even if it's not as archetypally centred around a city as Manchester is, there's still an obvious core. Now, if the people of Dudley really cannot face being called part of Birmingham, then maybe a name other than Greater Birmingham will have to do. But it cannot stay as the West Midlands. This is a city, and it needs to act like it. I dwell so much on the name because I think it has an important psychological effect. It's not so much that I think places need to defer to Birmingham, but they do need to acknowledge that they are dependent on it. To go back up north, Stockport being part of Greater Manchester isn't about it being subservient, it's that it benefits from positioning itself as part of Manchester. The likes of Walsall and Stourbridge would benefit from positioning themselves as part of Birmingham too, and they'd benefit even more from increased cooperation of local governments. Whilst we're at it, we should completely rejig the way Birmingham functions. The mayor and combined authority which governs the city region should take on many more roles, including lots that are currently the preserve of Westminster. Things like healthcare provision, aspects of education, some control of tax, and possibly even a little bit of legislative power. At the same time, local councils should be relieved of a lot of their strategic responsibilities, like planning new roads and developments or managing tourism. The councils are also very weird. Birmingham proper is the largest local authority in Europe, and it is absolutely massive. After central government cuts, and in particular an ugly pay dispute, Birmingham City Council declared bankruptcy in 2023, and an external investigation found that it lacks the capability to improve. The thing is, it was a Labour-run council under a Conservative central government, so it was at least superficially in the Conservatives' interests to let Birmingham suffer, which is what they did. Brutal cuts have been enforced, with social care rolled back, streetlights dimmed, almost all art funding gone, bin collections reduced, when they're collected at all, and libraries shut down. This is no way to treat our second city, and the people of Birmingham do not deserve this. They didn't personally cause the bankruptcy, and they don't deserve to personally pay the price. But okay, if you're the government, I understand why you might want to show to other councils that if they go bankrupt, they won't be rewarded for it. So I would say they should just break Birmingham City Council up. Divide it into a few more reasonably sized councils, wipe the debts, and help them get back on their feet. This way, no one gets rewarded, apart from the citizens of Birmingham. It would better allow councils to represent their areas, and localism should be encouraged, just like in London with Southall's bilingual signage and so on. Doing these things would finally give Birmingham a proper city government, of the sort that's ubiquitous across the developed world, but Britain has lacked for decades. It's municipal governments like this that can implement plans such as in this video. But ultimately, a city government is just formed of people, and there are more than enough capable individuals in Birmingham. If you're one of them, please think about getting involved. And if you're not, well, who am I kidding? Of course you are. You just sat through a 40-minute video about Birmingham, you've clearly got the interest. The world of local politics can be frustrating at times, but who told you it was going to be easy? If it were, everything would be fine and dandy already and there'd be no need for any change. There is a need for change, however, and if it comes to this old city, you can be certain it's going to run with it.